Maneco 64, home of alternative economics and contrarian views. So I had to contact Paul from the Sirius Report this morning because I want to know what's going on in China, because there's so much news in the West about China. And to me, I smell something, a rat, so to speak, because people who are usually on different sides of things like Zero Hedge, The Guardian, FT, New York Times, they're all on the same wavelength. and even people who were very anti-lockdown during the West against the narrative, they're like ganging up and assuming a lot of things about China. And before we started this interview, I was talking to Paul, and I quoted Mark Twain, and he said, "If you don't read the newspaper, you're uninformed. If you do, you're misinformed." So I think Paul is the best guy to have on to talk about what's going on in China, because he doesn't just listen to what the mainstream or governments are telling him. He digs under the surface to see what's really going on, because I think Paul and I agree that a lot of the stuff that comes out for the public is just narrative to make us think one way, but behind the scenes, they do something else. So Paul, sorry for the long introduction. Welcome, and how are you?
No, that's fine. And well, you can talk as long as you like. It's it's fine. But no, I'm very well. And yourself? And thank you, obviously, for getting in touch. You were fortunate, as I said. You were lucky today. The rest of the week's a bit snowed under with various things, so it was good timing.
Yeah, me too. I have a busy week ahead, seeing friends for lunch tomorrow, and a dinner on Thursday, and an interview on Wednesday. So I thought I really wanted to talk to Paul about what's going on in China. Yes, the Chinese government has been very draconian in terms of the lockdowns and the testing. I'm not denying that, but I think we need to dig under the surface, and I couldn't think of a better guy for that than you. So maybe you could tell us what you think is going on there.
Well, yeah, let's start, as I always say, nothing's black and white. And this is one of the big failings of social media and alt media. Immediately, people jump on things. It's all very black and white, and it means this, that, or something else. And as ever, it's anything but that. Now, just a small point, and I've made this point recently on Twitter again. From my perspective, China's zero COVID policy is ridiculous. And in very simple terms, it's because when does it end? Does it end when COVID ends? Well, when does COVID end? And the reality is it's not going to end anytime soon, because there are lots of endemic coronaviruses in circulation, and have been for years. So the argument is, when does it ever end? And it's completely unsustainable. Now, the reality is, which may surprise people, the vast bulk of Chinese people are actually very pleased the government does the things they do. They're pretty horrified how we've handled it. Their attitude is, all these people died, and you've just removed restrictions, and you're putting more people at risk, etc., etc. And okay, again, that's their perspective. This isn't about right or wrong. We're just stating how they feel about things. Whereas from our perspective, it gets to the point you just have to stop this, because irrespective, I know people have very different views on this, but there comes a point when whatever perceived benefit there is in doing it is just far outweighed by the practicality and reality. You cannot continue doing this. And even the UK and Europe and everywhere else has just reached the point and gone, quite some time ago, enough's enough, and we have to end this. Now, of course, we can look at this in perspective and say, undoubtedly, with regards to the protests, some of it is genuine. There are some people who are fed up, and I know people in China who've said to me, yeah, we're fed up with it, the endless kind of lockdown, then we're okay, and then 2 months later or 6 weeks later, we have to lock down. They're fed up with it, but most of them will just put up with it because it is the way it is. But there'll always be some people who go, I'm sick and tired of this. Now, the claim is there was supposed to be an incident, ironically, in Xinjiang, of all places, where there was a claim that there was a fire, and because people were in lockdown, they burned to death. And that was supposed to be the catalyst for all these protests. Now, at this point, I can't say whether that's true or not. I don't have any way of verifying. But as always happens, there's always a catalyst for these things when the West is involved. And there is undoubtedly, to some degree, Western meddling going on and trying to fuel protests. And there are certainly some footage of protests that have nothing to do with COVID. There are also footage of protests where, if you speak Mandarin or Cantonese, there are clear evidence, and I don't speak either language, but I know people who do, who've told me that there's people turned up in small protests, and the local residents of the city have been asking, who are you? You're not from here. Where have you come from? Why are you trying to stir problems up? So there's a whole raft of different things going on. It's certainly not massive protests either by any stretch of the imagination. And this, again, is one of these situations where there is some incident happening somewhere, and you might get a few disaffected people, and then suddenly all the usual suspects in the West jump on this, claiming that, Xi's about to be overthrown, the Chinese government's going to collapse, and all the usual statements that come out of which this is not reality. And undoubtedly, as I said, there are some people who are fed up with it and will protest. But of course, this is the interesting point, is all these people who previously claimed how draconian China is, and in the next breath going, oh, there's all these people protesting. Well, yes, there are people protesting, because in China, the truth is there are thousands of protests a year. A lot of it is people protesting about local government, which is very democratic, makes a lot of decisions and makes bad decisions, and the people get fed up with it and then protest and ask the central government to deal with it. The other thing that surprises a lot of people in the West, and I've seen this with my own eyes being there, but I've also know people who've reiterated the same stances. The Chinese people are actually quite often very vocal at the police. If you were vocal the way Chinese people are in China, in the United Kingdom, the police would arrest you. The other thing is, okay, I'm not saying in all cases, but often in these protests, you'll see, a lot of police. The Chinese police don't go around clubbing people over the head or tasering them, as we saw during lockdown protests in the West. That was often filmed by people. Again, I'm not saying there aren't instances where the police have been heavy-handed, but what I'm trying to say in a broader sense, this is the reality. So people in the West are kind of a bit confused. They're also a bit confused going, well, if the Chinese are suddenly protesting about this and they can just go out and protest, well, I thought they lived under this oppressive regime for decades. So why weren't they protesting about other things? So again, because basically they're not unhappy with their life, because again, the Western perception of life in China is not reality. And for many reasons, not least, as I always say to people, go to China and see it with your own eyes, and you'll be very shocked that it isn't how you perceive it to be. And culturally, it's very different. And the Chinese people have a very different attitude as to how life should be led. And I've made this point before, but it's worth reiterating. Chinese people regard that life's important for your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren, and it's all about the community. It's all about your local community. It's about villages. It's about towns. It's about districts, and it's built out that way. So whilst people in the West can't understand why the Chinese people have put up with it, from their perspective, these COVID restrictions all this time, it's because they largely believe it's for the greater good of the nation. And it's a very different mindset. But undoubtedly, there are, as there were during the Hong Kong protests, there were clear flaws in some of these protests. There were people there that didn't make sense. There are things where there was sloppiness in terms of, Chinese and things that were filmed that actually didn't make sense in Chinese, or situations where things were written in English in situations where you wouldn't expect that necessarily to happen. So for sure, undoubtedly, there are people disaffected and there have been people protesting, but the usual suspects in the West have jumped on this and they're trying to make it into something it isn't, and far bigger, because they're trying to stoke tensions in China because the West is desperate. I mean, the West was desperate to go into Hong Kong and try to overthrow the Hong Kong government. It failed. The whole coup attempt failed. And they're now trying it with China, which actually suggests very tellingly that this has come about just a matter of days after the Taiwanese government, which is very pro-independence, suffered very big losses to the opposition, which is not independence. They do want to follow the one China principle. Okay, it might be different from China's perspective, but the people were basically voting saying, no, we don't support these measures. We're not happy with the government for a whole bunch of reasons. And isn't it a bit surprising, perhaps, and I'm being, of course, sarcastic, in that suddenly, almost immediately, these protests kick off in China? Because here's the problem. If the people in Taiwan don't support the idea of independence from China, then it's going to be very hard to convince the Taiwanese people that they should defend Taiwan because of this ongoing tension trying to stoke with China with regards to invading Taiwan. So again, they paint the picture that China's this evil dictatorship, and look, they're trying to impose their will on Taiwan. So they're desperately trying to go China, and it hasn't succeeded. And is this just another way of saying, well, the kind of separatist government, or a government in Taiwan that's angling to be separatist, it's just not working. So we're going to have to resort to trying to stoke something in China. But yes, the idea that there's massive protest with and all this clever kind of photography and filming, trying to give the impression of something. There were protests, not all over China, and most of them were relatively small. You might get 100, 200 people. How many of them are bona fide people? I mean, I'm not going to make accusations against any individuals regards to this, but again, it's the other thing is we won't know because it was dark and people had masks on, ironically, which is to hide their identity, I don't doubt, but to some degree anyway. But the point is, we don't know who was involved, but there was certainly enough suspicion and suggestion, even from people in China itself, that there was some Western meddling done. It may also have something to do with the fact that Xi is due to go to Saudi Arabia within the next couple of weeks. And there's a lot of speculation of what might come out of those meetings, not least. I would be a bit surprised, but not entirely surprised, if there was some formal announcement about, or official announcement about, obviously, Saudi Arabia trading oil in the yuan. I think that might be a bridge too far, but the point is that is a possibility. But I think it more relates to the fact that the Taiwanese people have voted pretty overwhelmingly that they're not interested in conflict with China, mainland China. They might not agree with the whole concept of the one China principle, I don't doubt that, but they're very unhappy with the government for a whole bunch of reasons. And that may have made the US and maybe the UK, etc., look at this and go, hang on, this puts the whole idea we can somehow stoke tensions and start a war between China and Taiwan. It's going to be far more problematic on the basis that the people don't support the government in this regard. So that might be a possible reason why it's happened now. And of course, what's kind of interesting is in recent weeks, the Chinese have made some albeit very minor concessions with regards to starting to remove some of the more what you would call, or people in the West would call, draconian measures to do with this kind of zero COVID policy. So it doesn't actually stack up in the grand scheme of things. But for sure, China has to end. It's not sustainable, frankly, and I've said it's ridiculous. And I've always said, if China does ridiculous things, we'll say it as it is. It's just totally unsustainable. You cannot have this policy in place because it will never end. Because COVID could be here in 3 years. What are they going to do? Keep doing this? And whilst largely it hasn't affected their export-import markets, there comes a point where China's trying to say we want to internationalize the yuan and open up our markets and come and open up a factory in China. Well, if I'm sat there thinking, well, do I really want to open a factory in China? Because, I could go and spend, I don't know, tens of millions of pounds, put a factory there, employ a whole bunch of people, and after 2 weeks of getting operations off the ground, they shut the entire city down for 2 months or 4 weeks or whatever. I can't operate a business on that basis. And also, in terms of inward investment, they're going to suffer as a consequence of having this very sort of almost scattergun approach to handling COVID and this zero COVID policy. And it's very hard to know from one day to the next if they're going to just suddenly lock a region down, lock a city down, or make some sort of put measures in place that isn't conducive to inward investment or opening up more factories or whatever, or businesses inside China. So it's ultimately detrimental. They've got away with it so far, but there comes a point when enough's enough. And I don't doubt there are people inside China who would share that sentiment, but by and large, they don't. And it's not like we've seen millions of people protesting. It's not that. And the West, of course, likes to latch onto anything. And let's go back, just over 12 months ago, the whole Evergrande thing. Remember, all we got is Evergrande's China's Lehman moment. It's all going to collapse, and it's the end of China. Well, over 12 months later, all these Western experts don't ever talk about Evergrande anymore because it's a bit embarrassing because it didn't play out that way. But it's rather like all I've ever heard for 20 years, every year, 3, 4, 5 times a year, is China's going to collapse. China's economy, their dream's over. The Belt and Road's finished before it's even started. And it's usual just people in the West who talk about China who just repeat what other people have said. Or there's people who are deliberately misleading people, or there's people out there who have absolutely no clue about what China is as a nation, what the people aspire to, its culture, its work ethic, everything about it. They just believe what someone else has told them. Or they might have an axe to grind with China, and their perception is, well, I don't like China for this reason. And of course, fundamentally, there are elements in the Beltway who absolutely detest China because they think China is the major adversary and China's the biggest threat to unipolarity, meaning multipolarity. So there's an angle to this. And maybe I'll stop now so you can obviously speak, Mary, because there's a bit I want to talk about with central bank digital currencies and this whole thing about the World Economic Forum and social credit score system, because this all ties in with this attitude about China. And there's an important point, I think, worth discussing about that.
Yeah, and you spoke about the president of China going to Saudi Arabia, and I had spoken about that in one of my videos a few weeks ago, that it could be very significant because apart from the G20, Xi Jinping hasn't traveled abroad that much. So I thought it was significant he's going to Saudi Arabia. I'd forgotten about that. That could be one of the reasons why the West is trying to especially the media. And I've noticed actually on social media in the last week or two, there's been a lot of video clips and information about the lockdowns in China. Look how crazy this is and stuff. And I'm not saying it's not happening, but I was wondering why now? Why all this stuff? And all of a sudden, this happens in China. And yes, it's almost like they want to change the Western public's mindset about China. And we were speaking before our interview that this is to do with trying to make it seem that the world going multipolar is actually a bad thing. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that and go into the CBDCs and social credit in China.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it's an important point, but and I've kind of tweeted a bit about it because it was becoming very obvious in the last week or two, like you were saying, Mario, to do with things to do with the lockdowns and all sorts of claims being made that had no basis in reality, or most of it had no basis in reality. But what we do is let's just take a very brief step back to the Trump era. And remember when Trump laid out the red carpet for Xi in Florida, and it was like, we're going to be best buddies. And then all of a sudden, that just vaporized. And then there was the ridiculous trade war with China that completely backfired on the United States, was a total disaster. I'm not saying it didn't affect China to some degree, because it did, but vastly more affected the United States. And we're kind of nibbling around the edges of the apple of Taiwan. And also, of course, there's the whole Hong Kong kind of coup that failed. There was also the endless kind of probing around Xinjiang, which again, as I've said, I've been to Xinjiang, and unless someone managed to deceive my eyes everywhere, I didn't see anything that the West claims about it. And again, it's just sets this scene. And I don't like to kind of get into the left and right of politics, because everyone knows I despise politics, and I'm not interested in Republicans or Democrats or Conservative or Labour or any other political affiliation. They're all complete nonsense. They're all an illusion to make people all take sides and not realize the fact neither political party is of any benefit to anyone. Ultimately, it's self-serving, and when you scratch below the surface, much of what one party says, the other party actually says in reality, even though they'll pretend to argue and disagree with each other in public forums, including obviously the House, the Senate, or Parliament, for example, in the UK. But yeah, there's an important point with regards to, like, let's take central bank digital currencies, because there's a narrative that started somewhere, relatively not that long ago, and people just repeat it. You know, I hear what's like, it's all fully programmable, and what they'll do is they'll make you get your money, and you'll have to spend it all. If you don't, then they'll take the rest of it, and then they can cut you off from your central bank digital currency bank account, and then you know you'll be left high and dry. So you go into this dictatorship, and it came about because everybody refers to China's central bank digital currency. See, look, Chinese started it. And they don't have a clue what China's done with its central bank digital currency. And there's first point worth mentioning. This issue of you have to spend all your money in a given period of time because, look, that's what China did. No, that's not what China did. When China was testing the platform, they gave free digital money, small nominal amounts, to a whole bunch of people in different cities. And the stipulation was, look, you need to spend it in a given point of time. The reason is we're trying to test the viability of the backbone of this platform. We don't want people just dripping a few, by going to purchase things on this platform. We want to get a concerted effort to see, can it handle the throughput of all these transactions? That got twisted into this idea. No, China's doing this because of because that's the policy for central bank digital currencies. That's what the rest of the world's going to do. And it's all part of this kind of quasi or literal communist takeover, because there's a lot of people in the West who are desperate to try and convince people that multipolarity is actually China trying to take the world over and control the world and make it so it's like China. So we all have to have the Chinese central bank digital currency. And the other one is the Chinese social credit score system. Well, the mischaracterization in the West is so embarrassing. It almost defies belief, because predominantly the social credit score system in China only applies to businesses, not to people. But again, it's twisted. Well, we're going to tie all these together. The central bank digital currency that came out of China, they're going to roll it out all over the West. And then they're going to roll out this social credit score system. And then if you don't do as you're told, then they're going to dock points off you and impose all these restrictions. Again, it's part of this idea that this new world is coming out of China, and it's all about China. And it's almost like, Dan trying to sell the World Economic Forum as Klaus Schwab's this kind of being sold as this Bond-esque villain. Now, I'm no fan of the World Economic Forum, quite the contrary, or Schwab for that matter. But we have to bear in mind, Schwab's been around for 5 decades. And yet, nobody ever talked about the World Economic Forum, really, particularly much until particularly the last 2 or 3 years, which all ties in with the central bank digital currency narrative, the social credit score system narrative, and and Schwab's part of this almost kind of communist kind of attitude. You'll have nothing and you'll be happy, which actually was not exactly what was said at the time. But the point is, again, it's just painting this narrative. So this is a perfect foil for the right. And let's take the right in the US, who are going to say, look, this multipolarity is all about communism. It's quasi-communism. They're going to roll it out through the back door. But as I say, Schwab's spoken for years. He talked about some great reset in 2014 and about how we should look at doing all these kind of things he's talked about now. But everyone just ignored it. No one took any notice. And it's the old media who are making the big play about this more than anyone else. If governments themselves, okay, there was let's build back better during the COVID, because they were so panic stricken that people thought they were all going to be destitute. Then they went, we need to placate the people. That's a good phrase. It sounds like we care about the people, but do they talk about build back better anymore? No. They've dropped that narrative because the pandemic's not here anymore. We don't need to say that. So people conflate all these ideas and come to conclusions. And there's no basis in reality, because if Schwab was like this Bond-esque villain who controls the world, he's been pretty quiet for 5 decades, but suddenly, out of nowhere, he's controlling everyone. And then people go, well, these ministers, they went to the World Economic Forum. Well, so did Putin, but they're trying to tell me Putin's part of some plan to unveil a one world government, bearing in mind he's currently effectively at war with the United States. Russia is in Ukraine. Sorry, these stories don't stack up. And we know the United States is trying to get China to go to war with Taiwan. So Xi goes to the World Economic Forum. He's part of this plan as well. Well, sorry, reality doesn't stack up with these ideas. So what happens is there's this idea, and now it's so widely believed by so many people that it's kind of taken a life of its own, and people just have bought into this whole basis that this means this and this means that, and I'm piecing all these parts of the jigsaw together, and it's not. And basically what the right wants to do is, because I'm not saying that the right's any big fan of Russia, but if you look, because Trump, whatever we think, Trump's presidency, whether Trump was going to do anything or not, it's around his presidency was totally hijacked, even if he wanted to do something. And there was never they didn't want to go to war with Ukraine. I think the war with Ukraine is just some personal problem with a few people in the Beltway on the Democrat side. And that's how that all came about. But they never pushed Russia. They didn't want any war with Ukraine happening. that all came about when the Democrats came in, but they were certainly pushing the anti-China angle. And lo and behold, again, if you just look at the people who are pushing the anti-China narrative, they're predominantly either very obviously on the right, and I hate to use political, sort of analogies to things, or they're people who are kind of on the right, but trying to hide they're on the right because we're part of the alternative media, etc. So there's a very clear push, and the push is to convince people that multipolarity is just Chinese communism by the back door. Also to push the kind of narrative that we have to defeat this multipolarity because of what it stands for. And really, the left and the right wants to both preserve unipolarity. They might have different reasons for doing it or different motives to try, because the argument is if you squash and crush Russia, China will cave in and give up and go, well, we can't do this on our own. And the flip side belief is that if we crush China, then Russia will just cave in and give up. And it's kind of interesting, of course, as well, because the left-right paradigm is all blurred and it's not reality, really. It's kind of interesting given where we are with regards to the Ukraine war, which is a whole separate subject. But again, the timing is that there's people in the West now going, why are we fighting this war? There's people in the United States, even the military, going, we need a peace agreement. We have to sit down and have some negotiation. There's a lot of people who don't want the war to carry on. And it's kind of ironic, the attempt to crush Russia has failed thus far. So now we're moving back to China again. And this is what I mean. It's like, well, we can't destroy Russia. Let's go for China. Let's see if we can start a revolution inside China. Let's see if we can drag them into a war like we did with Russia. Maybe China will fail and China will collapse. So it's just different prompting, different kind of prodding, should I say, different elements within multipolarity, but principally China and Russia saying, okay, can we make something stick? And I think that, I hate to be conspiratorial or sound conspiratorial, but there are all these things. You look at it, what's happening in currently the state of the Ukraine. What doesn't surprise me, we're now back to China again, and we've always made the point that it'll always be China, Russia, and Iran, and they're kind of largely failing with Iran because they've had, and there again, they've had this attempt for several months now to engineer a color revolution. They'll overthrow the Tehran government, and they've even been providing protesters in inverted commas with arms that have been smuggled over the border from Kurdistan in Iraq, and there's people in the US who kind of admitted this was going on, but didn't say it was anything to do with that. So again, it's just the old familiar story. It's color revolutions, and who's the three nations particularly that anger the United States? It's China, Russia, and Iran. So we have to be extremely careful, and with regards to this idea that multipolarity is about China seeking to dominate the world, because that's what the United States did. And the United States' perspective is, well, we did that, so the only way the world can function is someone else has to dominate. Someone else has to have the global reserve currency, which, of course, there won't be one in the future. Someone else is going to have to dictate to the world and force the world to acquiesce to their viewpoint on everything. And of course, that's not what's happening. And this is why, as well, the United States thought we could isolate Russia on the basis of the Ukraine war. And they're going, hang on, it's not working. Well, it's not working in the global south. And now we're finding out there are nations in Europe who've been secretly actually importing Russian oil and getting Russian gas. And actually, there's the Europeans are being complicit in ferrying and shipping this oil and gas around as well. And this is the point. It's just the reality is the world is just not buying this anymore. They understand that this is just ridiculous propaganda, and therefore we're just not going to buy into this. But I don't doubt in any way, shape, or form that part of the whole sort of anti-China angle is certainly people with more right leanings in the United States and the UK and other places. And the whole point is, it's because, interestingly, to support this viewpoint is, I think, not that long ago, there's elements in the Beltway coming out going, well, as much as Russia's a problem, the biggest problem we have is China. And then, of course, lo and behold, we then see developments in the last couple of days with regards to these protests. So it all kind of stacks together. And as ever, we have to be extremely careful. But the bottom line is that the reason the West, and particularly the United States and the UK, are so desperate to crush China, Russia, and Iran is because they know once multipolarity succeeds, the United States as this hegemonic power is over, it's finished, it's gone. Rather like keeping Germany as a vassal state in Europe. If Germany says we've had enough of this, and let's be honest, they must be starting to look at, well, who really was responsible for the sabotage on Nord Stream 1 and 2? It's one of our allies. Do we really want to work with these allies anymore if they're prepared to do that to us? So what happens if Germany rotates east and joins Eurasia? It's over. NATO's gone, because people would go, hang on, so Germany doesn't have a problem with Russia anymore. So why are we pointing missiles at Russia? Well, we don't need NATO, so bye, America, go home. We don't need you anymore. So there are a lot of things in play here. And it's very clear the United States is panicking and is desperate to try and crush Russia, and it failed with the Ukraine war. They're trying to goad China with respect to Taiwan, and the elections might have just tipped that in out of, from the perspective of the Americans, out of their kind of position of leverage and advantage. And this is how it's going to be. And I made this point for the last couple of years. This is what you're going to see. All these kind of conflicts is because the United States as an empire is collapsing, and it's desperate. And instead of actually trying to do the right things in the process of trying to squeeze Russia, it's actually antagonizing its so-called allies or vassal states, to the point Europe's now getting very angry with the Americans with regards to sanctions, with regards to them abusing sanctions, with regards to try and profit at the expense of Europe with sanctions. And they're going, we're starting to have enough of this. And in the process, all the US is doing is antagonizing everybody. And it's the same with respect to China. And, you know, perhaps it's also just a coincidence, but with regards to the European Union, Charles Michel is due in China on the 1st of December for extensive talks with regards to future relations with the EU. Is this also because of this? Because the United States thinks, hang on, the European Union's actually not kind of agreeing to our stance with regards to economically trying to decouple from China, because Europe's going, we can't do this, and rightly it can't do this. It kind of sort of learned a little bit of a lesson. Decoupling from Russia with energy was an extremely bad move, although they won't publicly admit it. So the US's ability to control the narrative is irrelevant. They're not controlling reality. And the reality is Europe doesn't want to isolate and decouple from China. The Global South most certainly doesn't. So who's left? The United Kingdom, the US, and even the US is kind of half faking and pretending it's decoupling, while in the next breath going, well, actually, we don't really want to decouple. We still are dependent on China, and we'll just try and persuade everyone else to sanction China and decouple from them, whilst we'll do the exact opposite. And of course, Russia's the same. The United States has been getting Russian oil the whole time the war's been ongoing, and fertilizers, whatever the United States needs, it just keeps saying, well, we'll just keep getting these. Forget the sanctions. Just rubber stamp this and make sure we get what we need. And Europe in the process is looking at this going, hang on, you're telling us to implement these sanctions. You're not actually implementing them yourself. So it's kind of just all these things are coming into play all at the same time. And it's certainly no coincidence that in recent weeks, I think the emphasis from the West with regards to the Ukraine war is changing, even in the United States. And therefore, when that happens, if they can't succeed in crushing Russia and Ukraine winning the war, they'll then go back to China, because this is what the US does. If it's not succeeding with this country, it'll go and try it at some other endeavor with China. I mean, they've been kind of probing a bit with Iran, failing to garner any support, and particularly, just as a small example, although quite a significant example, was they were trying to claim the Iranians were going to launch some missile strikes on Saudi Arabia. And the Saudis basically ignored them, didn't believe them. The Iranians said it wasn't true, and it all died a death rather quickly. So it's just indicative of the US just nibbling away all over these disputed regions, or regions of potentially volatility or the risk of war, and they're just constantly looking for an angle to create some instability, and it's failing, and they're getting more and more desperate, and as they get more and more desperate, the world's looking at things going, hang on, we're just not buying this anymore. And I think one point worth making is that, as a final point in this regard, if you look at the missile that landed in Poland, the Western media came out almost the second it struck this farm in Poland, going it was Russia responsible. And within 2 hours, the State Department and the Pentagon were going, we see no reason to escalate this matter. So they'd obviously picked up the back channel, got on the phone to the Russians who had nothing to do with us, gone, okay, fine, well, obviously it's just a stray missile. Okay, let's just move on from this. And obviously that then shows there are elements in the US who had enough of the Ukraine war. And the US is far from this united front anymore. There's 4 or 5 different factions in the US who have very different perspectives on China, on Ukraine, on Iran. There are people who want the war with Ukraine to end up in World War III, which isn't going to happen. There are ones who want to keep backing Ukraine in the hope that Russia will lose the war. And there are ones who are going, this war should have been over months ago. It's not sustainable. We cannot keep pumping arms into Ukraine, because Western nations have all but run out of arms themselves. So what ends up happening is Russia destroys the infrastructure. You end up with the Ukrainian army having no weapons, no fuel, no water, or the risk of it, and no food. So how are they going to fight a war? It's impossible. So this is, again, always coming back to the point that the world is a very complicated place. It's very convoluted. There are no simple, as black and white idea that there's these group of people who control the world and they're the ones pulling all the levers and making things happen. That's not how the world operates. And it never has operated that way. And unfortunately, there's a lot of people being sucked into this belief that this is how the world functions and operates. And no doubt in history, there were families and who had a big say and influence, but they don't have that say and influence anymore. They're not what they once were. And as ever in the world, there are competing influences, people with different perspectives, different ideas as to how they think the relationship with China should be handled, or Russia or Iran. And there's no agreement. And this is why in recent weeks we're actually publicly seeing this disagreement, where you have Milley, who's coming out going, we need to have negotiation. We need a peace agreement. We need to, this is a good opportunity to end the war, as it were, from a military perspective. I mean, this is unprecedented, but it shows that the divisions inside the United States are so big now that they're spilling out into the public domain and not staying in the private domain. And it's the same in Europe. I mean, in Europe, you have the Atlanticists in Brussels who just want the war to never end. They'll fight, let's fight till the last Ukrainian. And if they're all killed, let's just get a bunch of kind of mercenaries and who, volunteers from Europe. Let's just keep the war going forever. Let's just bankrupt Europe in the process, but who cares? And by the way, that's not deliberate either. That's just absolute crass stupidity and an ideological hatred that's just blinding people in the European Commission, etc., to reality. Then you have people inside individual nations who are going, we can't, this war has to end. And then there's people going, no, we have to keep this war going. Remember, we've invested all this political capital, and if we don't do this, then our political careers are over. And who's going to employ us? No one. So we just have to keep digging a hole and hoping somehow a miracle happens. And then you have other people in politics and big business going, this is insanity. You're destroying the nation. You're destroying economies, the financial system, societies. You're deindustrializing us. And then, you have Schultz coming out going, we need 200 billion to save jobs, to save businesses so they don't all collapse. And that's, again, because they're not trying to destroy everything and make us all have nothing. Because if we all have nothing, what happens then? They just print universal basic income for the entire population. Well, look at the United States. How much is that going to cost them a month? $1 trillion? If you print $1 trillion, what's that going to do? You're in Weimar territory within the blink of an eye.
Yeah, and like with Germany, if you destroy industry in Germany and everything, and you print the 200 billion, what good is it going to do? I just wanted to ask you a couple of questions to do with the CBDCs, because I'm sure a lot of the viewers are going to be asking questions, because
Sure.
we've seen people like the managing director of the BIS with the famous clip where he says we're going to keep track of everything with the CBDCs, and then you have the clip of what's his name, Sunak, when he was chancellor, saying the same thing, that it's going to be programmable. So, but you seem to think the CBDC is just going to be a technological thing and not a control mechanism. So people who asked the question, so what about Carstens and Sunak saying that they're going to be programmable and that they're going to track you? Does that concern you, or you think people are taking it out of context?
Well, it's okay. Let's try and. It's a very valid question, and I know it concerns people because it seems very contradictory from what I'm saying. But let's start with the position of central bank digital currencies. The US is currently doing a trial for some kind of digital dollar with the Fed, but a whole bunch of financial institutions, and it's all to do with wholesale international payments, because it speeds them up, they're much cheaper, and they're much more transparent. So you can track every single transaction, and there's no chance of partly this is probably to do with Russia bypassing sanctions. But Russia's not going to be part of a US central bank digital currency anyway, but it's part of the process that's where the traceability comes in. And thus far, all the indications from everyone trying, it's for wholesale, not for retail. Now, because China trialed it with retail, just to test it internally, because they've got a huge population, people went, that's what they're going to utilize it for. But the resistance from the banking sector is, hang on, you're not going to control all payments coming out from a central bank. The other thing is central banks don't want to do that, because then they're responsible for everything. They like to very conveniently go, we just deal with monetary policy. What? So then they're responsible for fiscal policy? They're not very comfortable doing that. They don't want to do that. And are we supposed to believe that central banks are going to effectively say to to the financial sector and all the too big to fail banks, by the way, we're putting you out of business? And how does business operate? If you want to have a business, let's say I open up a company in the United Kingdom and I employ people. and they earn a salary. And my business buys and sells stuff, or maybe looks to sell stuff, but I have to buy some raw materials because it's a manufacturing company. How does that work with the central bank digital currency? It's impossible. No business could function on the basis, oh, they're going to pay you money. Well, does that mean the companies pay all the salaries to the central bank, who then gives it to people? This is not practical reality. That's not how the real world works. I mean, and again, it's just one of those things where, yeah, who cares what? I mean, Sunak comes out with a whole bunch of things. So do politicians. But I mean, Sunak didn't even know how to use contactless in a shop. So I mean, frankly, I don't really care whether what Sunak says or doesn't say particularly. With regards to the BIS, well, BIS can say it's fully programmable. What does it, in what context was that said? And here's a likely scenario for you. And this is going to have people going, see, I told you this was going to happen. There's every risk as the West collapses and the economy collapses, the financial system. The risk is the banking sector could collapse, or we have serious problems. Now, what's the alternative? Do nations allow that situation to go on for weeks and months? So how does people pay for anything? The whole country grinds to a halt. Then we have massive societal unrest because everyone's starving. Everyone's hungry. Everyone could be freezing cold if it's winter because everything would grind to a halt. Because the whole system depends on endless kind of payments domestically and internationally. Huge amounts go on. If that all stops, the whole world grinds to a halt. So the argument is they will have no choice. And then they'll go, see, we told you they're always going to roll out universal basic income. One of the things that the central banks might have to do, and even though they don't particularly want to, they would want to roll out a facility where universal basic income can be paid directly to people, which means we'd have to, and to be paid directly to people, that's the other thing, you would have to have a bank account. If they're going to pay the money to you, you would have to have a bank account in some capacity. Or are we all supposed to have debit cards with an account at a central bank? This is not reality. That's not going to happen. So the problem is all these stories have got conflated into something where people come to an assumption that somehow we're going to have a situation where in the future, central banks will control all money. So what we're basically telling ourselves is the existing financial system that all these people think controls everything is going to relinquish all its control. All these people who've profited enormously they're all going to lose that position of wealth creation and control. They've all agreed to give it all up. Now, if you hear the major banks in the West, who all said there's no way relinquishing control via some central bank digital currency. But, we want to utilize it because it's going to be cheaper for payments, more cost effective, a lot quicker, more transparent. Yeah, we're quite happy with that. But the problem is if we work on the basis that was to happen, and all this thing, you'll own nothing and you'll be happy. Well, here's the problem. The entire Western world works on endless cheap credit and endless consumption. If we all stop consuming, because here's the thing, if we had nothing, what are we going to consume? So nothing. So all these big corporations will go bust. So all these billionaires who've only become rich in inverted commas with fiat money on the basis that we just keep consuming and buy all their goods and services, we're going to stop doing that because we won't be able to afford to do it. So the entire Western corporations will go bust. I mean, if you can't afford a mobile phone, well, what does that say for mobile phone companies and those who manufacture mobile phones? No one will be buying them. That's just a simple example. So We're basically, this is this idea again, and it comes back to the communist thing. It's neo-feudalism, that somehow we're going to exist in a technocracy that's neo-feudal. That is impossible. It's a contradiction in terms. It can't possibly work. The only way the Western world works is if we're endlessly consuming stuff most of the time we don't need. And that way, that keeps people employed. And it also makes the rich richer and richer. I mean, but if you cut that off, they've got nothing either. So all these rich, influential people are all prepared to give that all up as well. I mean, let's just use. I mean, here's a great example because the World Cup's on. We know in the UK we have the Premier League, and the Premier League's huge business. Why? Because Sky pays all the clubs huge amounts of money. And also because then millions of people subscribe to Sky to watch Premier League football. Well, in this new world, that wouldn't exist. So we're supposed to believe that this big business that is very lucrative, they're just going to give up and go, oh, we're not having that anymore. Okay, there's not going to be a Premier League. There's not going to be all these footballers paid this money, and that will all just disappear as well. No, there's too many people with too much to lose to go, we're just giving all this up. And thus far, in reality, there's no indication why. They would want everyone to have some sort of weird bank account at a central bank. I don't quite know how you access it, and you have to spend all this money. But by the way, you'll have nothing, in which case, what jobs are people going to have? But it's just one of those situations, and I hate to go to the pandemic, but there's a great example of how this narrative constantly gets twisted. Remember when the pandemic started and they had the lockdowns, and there was people going, well, now we're in lockdown. We'll always be in lockdown. This is the technocracy. This is the neo-feudalism. We're all going to be digital slaves. It'll be the central bank digital currency next, and the social credit score system. We're all screwed because the whole thing gets conflated into the same thing. And then they remove the lockdown. Oh, they'll just do it for a few months and they'll bring it back. They're just letting us have some time off. Really? And then, of course, eventually, they just removed all restrictions. And then these people go, oh, hang on, how are we going to spin this story? I know, let's spin it. The first time was a dress rehearsal. The next pandemic will be the one they'll do this to us. And we had a week or two when monkeypox came out. Oh, this is it. This is what they're going to use. Of course, it was never going to happen. And this is what happens. People just keep spinning a narrative. They're trying to ram square pegs in round holes. And the whole pandemic statement just fell apart because here we are today. Well, hang on, it didn't pan out the way these people suggested. But of course, they always roll everything into technocracy, feudalism, central bank digital currency, social credit score system. They're going to track every single person on this planet. Well, here's the point. We all have digital bank accounts. If they really wanted to, they can easily apply for a court order and have your bank account switched off, and they could claim you or whatever they want to claim. But it just doesn't happen. But apparently in this new world, that's how the new world's going to function. Well, let's take the United States as a great example of this. Imagine if you reduce the United States to neo-feudalism, where everyone has nothing and everyone has to function in this world, bearing in mind there's 600 million guns in the US. And let's see how long that version of the United States would last. It's not going to last very long. And again, it comes back to this point. You might have got away with feudalism hundreds of years ago, but the world's a very different place now. You're not going to, and you're going to control people with technology, but hang on. So what element of technology are you going to control them with? But you're going to restrict all these other access to technology. How long is it going to be before all the things, how the world really operates and all the disgusting evil things that go on and all the things we know is reality? If you start doing that, you're going to just make everyone go, hang on a minute. This world isn't what I thought it was. The only reason they control people is by giving them enough to make them believe. You know what? I hate politicians. I don't like Labour. I don't like Conservative. I'll vote for the other one. I can't stand whatever. but I'm doing okay. Yeah, I grumble a lot, but I can pay my mortgage, and I've got a job. It's not a great job, but I can make ends meet. So yeah, I'm okay. I'm doing all right. If you take that away from people, and then you're saying basically you've got nothing, and we're going to destroy the very essence of your life, everything you've worked for. Doesn't matter how mild-mannered people is, they're not going to tolerate it. They're already worried enough in Western nations about the likes of you and I this winter. And hang on, what happens if they can't pay their bills? We're talking about, bankrolling people even more. Just keep them happy. Their governments are really worried that we could have a situation where the economy and the financial system implode, and people really, there are people struggling with the cost of living crisis. They're genuinely worried this could cause massive societal unrest. And this is being spoken about publicly, some degree privately, in the UK, across Europe, in Brussels. We could lose control of the masses. They're really worried about this. So if they're worried about that when the world's kind of notionally functioning okay, if you turn the world into some kind of neo-feudalistic technocracy, people are not going to tolerate it. And very quickly, even if they try to do that, then it's not going to succeed. And the other thing is, as I said, the banking sector, all these big corporations, all these big billionaires and more are all going to effectively have nothing. And they're all going to agree to this as well. So some few people somewhere control us all for what purpose? And we're really going to control a world of 300 million Americans, 500 million Europeans. Because bear in mind, the global south's not going to be part of this. They're going to be doing their own thing. Because you're not going to get China, Russia, and Iran, and the global south taking part in this kind of quasi, whatever it is, neo-feudalistic technocracy. Because by the way, the one world government's nonsense. The one world government was attempted in 1944 at Bretton Woods. And the British and the Russians turned to the Americans and went, forget it, it's not happening. And the Russians the US nibbled away with unipolarity, which is one world government. And they tried it and it's failed. And it was never going to succeed. So people saying they're rolling out one world government is 78 years too late. They've already tried it and it's failed. And the Russians have come out and said, they tried it, and it's long since failed. And it's not going to be possible to do this. So I think instead of just responding to the same people making these comments, people need to think of the practical reality of if you tried to do this, what would happen in the world? What's the reality of this? Because the other thing is, if you destroy everybody financially, there is no financial sector anymore. It's gone. What are they going to invest? Who's going to invest in what? Companies that don't exist. How are governments? What government's going to sell debt to what government? You're talking about something that's not. It's like communism on steroids. Again, it's because the new world, this multipolarity. It's all about communism. It's all about state control over everything because, that's what happens to people in China. This is how it all comes about. And now it's become this established belief. But if you break it down and look at the reality of what's actually happened in that situation, you start to go, hang on, how is that possible? How can that ever happen in reality? And it can't. Because you're going to put so many people's noses out of joint and you're going to totally destabilize the West. And for the benefit of who? So they want to control everyone. Well, they control everyone anyway, in a way. As things stand now, there's very little disagreement with anything that happens in the West. People are buying into the mainstream media narrative by and large. They don't need to make draconian steps, which would actually threaten their own existence, whoever they are, of course. It's totally counterproductive because they then might control us all, but in what capacity? By endless printed money. So we're going to print trillions and trillions of dollars or euros or pounds or whatever it is for people to spend money on what? Well, what companies are going to still exist? How's this world going to function if no one has anything? Because it's all consumption based. So we don't consume. None of these companies exist. So we're all going to go into, into, I don't know, Starbucks or something and buy a coffee with what and how? Because how does that company even exist? How does this function? Because we're literally talking about destroying the entire society so there's nothing left and going, that's going to function in the 21st century. Well, seriously, there's no chance that will function because we're already seeing the panic station setting in there. There's too many people with too much invested in the world as it is now to let go of that. And if we don't think that's the case, why do we think since 2008 they've done everything to keep the financial system going, to prevent the West collapsing, to engineer color revolution, to try and destroy Russia, China, and Iran? Because they're trying to keep the empire alive. And because if they wanted to destroy the empire, like people claim, and they're going to do it all deliberately, well, they could have just done it in 2008. Why are they so desperately trying to keep it going? Because they know when unipolarity is dead, multipolarity is the future, and it already is beginning to make significant strides forward, which is why the US is becoming more and more desperate. But the reason they're desperate is because once that empire is gone, everything that empire stands for, its financial system, its big corporation, they've got. It's over. They're never going to those days of milking the system and screwing all of us just enough so we don't notice is over. And if you start screwing the people to the extent they've got nothing, even very mild-mannered people are going to turn around and go, I'm not putting up with this. And we're supposed to believe they've calculated the fact that they know this isn't going to be a problem, rather like they calculated the fact they were going to start a war in Ukraine and destroy Russia's economy, the ruble, its financial system, and remove Putin. Well, that didn't pan out too well for them. Rather like they could destroy China. Well, that didn't pan out well for them. Rather like they were going to remove Assad. Well, he's still in power. Or we're going to destroy Afghanistan and control it. Well, the Taliban's in control of Afghanistan. And the list goes on and on. If they're that good at doing what whoever these people are, which is highly questionable anyway, well, they seem to make a spectacular failure of far smaller projects than the idea that they're going to destroy the West and control the world by some very, very bizarre one world governance system. And so, again, my point about this is people need to just think, what is the reality if this came about? What does that actually mean as to how the Western world, for example, will function or not function? And then ask themselves, is that really going to be a reality? And it can't be a reality because there are too many people with too much invested to want to keep this system going, which is why they're desperately trying to do it. They're not just going to go, well, it doesn't matter, we'll just give it all up for nothing, because what are they going to be? They're going to have billions and trillions of dollars that they can't spend in a system where the whole world hates them. And they're going to be hiding out in some island in the middle of nowhere so the masses don't, try to kill them. That's what we're talking about. And these people, we're not going to do that. We're doing great at the system. Okay, we don't believe the system will collapse, but we're doing okay. So we're not going to go, we'll just give it all up. Give it all up for what? Because you can have $1 trillion, but if the world's some technocracy and neo-feudalistic state, effectively, it's pointless. It's what you can't. They'll have all this ultimate power. What? So there's going to be a few people, whoever these few apparently are going to control billions of people this way. I mean, this is like a sci-fi movie. This is a lot of this came from Hollywood and science fiction. That when they'll create this dystopian future for humanity. Well, let's think about the practicality and reality and actually start to look, is this even feasible? And the reality is it's not feasible. And the West isn't going to do that because it knows that it will destroy itself. And no, it doesn't want to destroy itself because it's done everything for 14 years to keep this crazy financial system and economy and society going at any cost. Because, and that's why when people go, oh, they're destroying everything, to really look, they're deindustrializing Europe, or oh, all these businesses are going bust. It's all part of the plan. No, if your economy and your financial system's collapsing through crass stupidity, mismanagement, arrogance, ignorance, and everything else, that's the reality. But people twist and go, no, we told you years ago this was all going to collapse. Well, yeah, I told people in 2006 and 7 the West is going to collapse. Was it a conspiracy theory then? This is because they made spectacularly bad decisions. This has been baked in the cake for even longer. It's been baked in the cake since the 80s with financialization of economies. This was the beginning of the end. So it's not some deliberate plan. It's coming about because of the stupidity of these people. And people are going, they can't be that stupid. There must be a devious plan. No, they're that stupid. And we just have to look at the Ukraine war to realize that they have gone to everything to try and destroy Russia. In the process, they've destroyed themselves because they are that stupid. And I mean, forever tweeting, this is the clown show once again. That is what we're dealing with. People who have no understanding of the reality of the world. They make decisions on the basis of ideological hatred. They make decisions on the basis of believing that if I think this is the outcome, this will be what the outcome will be. And have no basis in understanding that, well, hang on. As I said from the first day of the war, if the West rolls out sanctions the way they're claiming, the West will collapse. Because it was a statement of the obvious. But these people don't see it. And we need to start being more concerned about the caliber of the people in the West who can deal with what's coming, rather than believing they're all in some plan to collapse everything. Because, I mean, here's the point. If you're the prime minister of a country and the entire nation collapses, and it's some deliberate plan, well, what are these prime ministers going to do? They're still going to be a prime minister in a nation where, let's face it, we have 75,000 armed forces personnel in the UK. Don't know how many police we have. And they're going to control 60, 70 million people who've lost everything. Really? No, absolutely not. So I've rather labored the point, but there's an important point in it. We need to deal with what's the fallout of what would actually happen, as opposed to just buying this idea that there's this devious plan that's been in place for years, because there is no devious plan to destroy everything. Because when in history has an empire ever gone, I know, let's destroy ourselves, and we'll come back 5 minutes later and we'll have more control, more power? It never happens. It just doesn't happen, because that's not reality. That's it's Hollywood. It's kind of just this incredibly entertaining idea that somehow you can destroy yourself and come back 5 minutes later even stronger with more power and influence over the people. That's never happened in history, and because there's a simple reason. When an empire's gone, it's gone. And the Western Empire, when it's gone, will be gone forever. Okay, at some point it joins multipolarity and becomes great nations amongst equals, as the US and the UK, etc., should be. But you know, it's just, that's reality, and we need to deal with the reality instead of what I've called all this entertainment, which is what a lot of the alt media is. It's entertainment. It's enthralling. It's intriguing. It's frightening. It drives people into euphoria and fear, and you make them captive to believe that something's coming about. When, if you just sit there for 5 minutes, go, hang on, let's look at the reality of this, you very quickly go, no, hang on, that's not why they're doing what they're doing. They did what they did in the Ukraine war because they thought Russia would collapse. And when it didn't, they went, well, we just have to keep digging, more sanctions, and in the process, destroying more and more of the fabric of the West. Because that's what politicians do. They invest political capital, and if they U-turn, they're all going, well, we're all finished in politics, but we want to survive in politics. So they just keep digging, thinking, well, somehow we'll win. And, oh, we'll get the media to spin stories about Ukraine, because then The masses will believe we're winning. They'll stick behind us. But now they're also worried that increasingly people in the West are going to have had enough of this war. Hang on a minute. You're pumping tens of billions or hundreds of billions or whatever it is, dollars of aid. No one's got a clue where it's going, and no one knows where all the weapons are going, because half of them are ending up back in Europe or in the Middle East. By the way, we've got a cost of living crisis. I can't pay my bills, and you're subsidizing a war in Ukraine. Sorry, we've had enough of this. So, again, this is reality. This is why things are happening the way they are. It isn't some deliberate plan. I know, let's collapse the West. So let's go to war effectively with Russia. And that's not how it works. That's not how the real world operates.
Yeah, and yeah, I mean, it's refreshing to hear your opinion, because I have to admit, I've fallen victim to like I'm not saying they're conspiracy theories, but we're hearing about the World Economic Forum and everything. I've looked into that too. But what you said about the pandemic is true. I remember back in 2020, beginning of 2021, I thought I'd never travel again. I thought I have to have a track and trace, but we never needed it. Now we're back to normal. So I have to agree with you on that. My final question though is if, and I'm not saying this because I'm disagreeing with you, if there's no plan to collapse the empire, like you said, which doesn't make sense, like the Romans didn't want to collapse their empire, nor do the Americans. Despite that, the financial situation, the fact that we have financialized for 40 years and we have a huge debt bubble and derivatives bubble, still makes it probable that we will have some kind of collapse. And if we do, what do you think is the best way to protect yourself, not just financially, but in other ways as well?
No, it's a great question, and I totally agree with you. And, we have to think objectively. I mean, at the end of the day, the logic is, and even not even logic, the reality is that, and we have to be careful because, look, the Soviet Union collapsed, and then Russia collapsed, but it came back, and the collapse in Russia, in some senses, was far worse than what we are going to experience. I mean, in some ways, it's worse here, but in most ways, it's not anywhere near as bad here. The issue is we're kind of at the mercy of this just-in-time system, where okay, we can try and protect our wealth with real assets and real money, which everyone knows what that means. But what do we do? I mean, I don't want to be like turn into this, this prepper on steroids, but the argument would be, given we could have, let's just look practically. This winter, we may have blackouts. We may have periods where, despite the West going, we're fine with gas and electricity. We don't necessarily know that. So you might want to take precautions in terms of food, because just to make sure, if you can, that you have some additional food in case there's disruption. I mean, that's not going into doomsday scenario. That's a very realistic risk. And certainly, as things stand, we go into 2023. And next winter, arguably, will be worse than this winter in terms of the risk. So I think there's sensible precautions. I mean, obviously, there's people who can avoid using gas and electric if you've got, wood burners or whatever. But, that's not practical now to go and install a wood burner. Good luck trying to get someone to fit one. But you can only take some necessary measures just to protect yourself and your family. And I think that's logical, and also food, that's non-perishable. So if you don't use it, because hopefully none of this scenario turns out in that regard. But in the broader sense, if things collapse, we're going to have to be heavily dependent for a short period of time, whatever that means, on the government, and that's Now, we're not going back into see, we told you they were going to do this. They're gonna have to do something, because if the financial system collapses and the banking system collapses, now they can arguably ring fence retail and try and keep the retail banks going, and I don't dispute that's possible. There are ways around this. My biggest concern is when I look at the caliber of people in the West, I'm looking at going, well, and logically, who's going to be there to know what to do? Who's going to actually be able to be in a position to go, okay, we've got this crisis. Now, we know if there was ever a crisis where there was a situation where food supplies are cut off, there is enormous dry food, which they normally give to the military. There's huge amounts of contingency where people would possibly have to live on that for a period of time if the worst came to the worst. There are measures in place for a disaster in the UK. I don't know so much about other nations, so that might mitigate some of the problems. But we're in a situation where we know that this financial system just cannot carry on, and and we're back to that argument. They can lower interest rates, raise interest rates. Ultimately, they'll blow everything up one way or the other. This is not, it's totally unsustainable. So all you can do is do as much as you can to make sure that you can try and protect your wealth, and you can feed yourself, and if you've got alternative ways of heating your house, then great as well. But that's not always practical. But as I say, I always say collapse, and sometimes in the next breath I'm going to be careful what you mean by that, because we have to put this in proportion. As I said, Russia collapsed, and it was horrendous. But a lot of people may somehow muddle through, and they manage to do it. But that is as much to do with the spirit of the nation, about people just in Russia. No, you could be down to the last two 80-year-olds fighting the West, and they'd be there with a pots and pans to knock some person or some soldier from the whoever they were fighting with. That's the kind of spirit of the nation. My fear in the West is we don't have those people. People will just cave in. They'll collapse. They'll just be in total despair, because they will go, how did this ever happen? And they won't actually have that strength of character. But maybe, extreme adversity will hopefully brings people together, and people will become the things we're worried they might not be capable of doing. But we have to also hope that eventually someone in the West goes, look, the empire's over, hegemony's over, the dollar's dead, and this financial system is gone. What we need to, for want of a better word, have another Bretton Woods, and sit down with the multipolar world and the global South, the Chinese, the Russians, and everyone go, okay, look, we know it's over. We've got huge problems. We need a global collective response to this. And it's possible then you could mitigate the worst aspects of what's going to happen. And maybe that eventually will happen, but we seem a million miles away from that at the moment. So there are possibilities that we can avert the more serious aspects of this, but we just have to be realistic that this is a possibility. And certainly in governments in the West, they're really worried about a collapse happening on what society may perceive from this, how they may react, and they may react adversely. And then they don't know how to deal with the problem, because, if and I'm not saying it'll happen, but if you paint the worst possible case scenario, and just to illustrate a point, if you end up in a situation where millions of people are totally destitute, governments can't control millions of destitute people and how they may react. And it's going to be a world of difference. People go, well, look at how everyone reacted during the pandemic. Yeah, because they thought they could have died from this horrendous virus. That's a world of difference than going, well, you've just lost, effectively, you've lost everything. Your pension's gone. Maybe you can't pay your mortgage anymore, or you can't pay your debts. Your bank accounts, maybe it's frozen temporarily or whatever, and everything they've worked for, that's nothing to even remotely like controlling, in inverted commas, people during the pandemic. It's a totally different situation. people are not going to react well to that. They might agree to being locked down or whatever and to making all these measures because they thought it was for the greater good. Okay, we can argue and discuss till we're blue in the face about the reality of that. But if we put them in the situation where every person's going, do you know what? I have this pension, it's gone. I can't pay my mortgage anymore. I've lost my job. I've lost everything. I've worked really hard. Yeah, I've done the same, and this affects huge swathes of the population. And then and this is more than ever going to affect the middle class. It's always the middle class that gets wiped out in these situations. The argument is the rich might still be rich to some extent, but they're going to be, it's all relative. They're not going to be rich in inverted commas the way they were unless they invest in sound money. And believe it or not, a lot of them don't because they don't think it's necessary because they don't believe this is going to happen. And that's another point. If you talk to people during the collapse of the Soviet Union, the collapse of Russia, practically everybody, even though the writing was on the wall, it was very obvious Russia would collapse. Practically just about everyone in Russia went, no, it won't happen. That's not going to happen to us. That's impossible. I'm not just talking about the oligarchs at the time or anything like that. They all went, no, this is impossible. We'll be fine. No worries. And then it collapsed, and they're all like, how did that happen? A few people saw it coming and understood. So there's a precedent where people think all these rich people, they've all got it sussed out. They're all protecting their wealth. You'd be surprised that a lot of them aren't. They don't think there's a problem because rather like people in Russia, they went, no, that won't happen to us. And they just know that what inflationary collapse, the massive deflationary depression on steroids, that happens somewhere else. It never happens in our country. It's because we're the West. That happens in nations in the global South. Massive inflationary collapse, that's Zimbabwe or some other nation. That doesn't apply to us. So don't assume that they have a grasp of the reality of what's unfolding. So no, it's a great question, and we can only do what we can do and hope, that we're as prepared as we can be. But there's a whole unknown quantity, and collapse is, as I say, we have to be careful. It can mean many things, but in essence, it's really just the end of the Western Empire as it is now. But it doesn't mean we're all going to be clubbing each other over the head to try and survive killing some livestock with bows and arrows. I'm exaggerating for a fact, but you get the point. We have to be careful that we're not assuming we're going to end up in that situation. But life as people have understood it and how the Western world operates is going to radically change. And so it's a kind of collapse in that sense. But the degree to which it happens depends on whether governments are capable of realizing there comes a point that this is not sustainable. There's something horrendous going to happen. We have to do something about this. We can't continue, or they just continue because they arrogantly don't think it applies to them or to us as people. Now, that happens somewhere else in the world. There are many possible permutations and outcomes in this. But the one thing is, without a shadow of a doubt, if, as people like to think, they'll collapse and destroy everything, that was the outcome in the end. The people in governance, the people in the financial institutions, the people in the big corporations, they're going to be the most frightened people on this planet. Because all of a sudden, what are people going to do? What's the first reaction people will have if that happens? They'll want to blame someone. So who are they going to blame? They're going to blame politicians. They're going to blame the bankers, as people like to call them. They're going to blame all the big corporations. They can blame everyone who's rich. Because as far as they're concerned, it's the rich and the people with the power who are to blame. That's inevitably going to happen. So these people are going to, whoever is perceived to be wealthy, they're going to be feeling extremely uncomfortable by it. And then, of course, the question is what happens politically? And this is a big concern because we've seen in history where when nations collapse, you sometimes, and I'm not trying to draw parallels in history too much, but we get strong men who come to the fore, and the people believe in them because they're nationalists and they care about the country, and we'll sort the problems out. we're going to remedy all the problems these other governments created. And these people are even worse. They're not better than, and that's how bad they can be. And they may sound like they are sincere. They may even believe they're sincere, but they don't have the capabilities. They may make things even worse. And then we have a period where people will believe in these governments and then find very rapidly they're absolutely clueless at managing what is going to unfold. And therefore we might have situations because of societal problems that we get strong-armed governments in the West to go, well, the only way we can govern is by trying to control people. Because otherwise, if we don't do that, then society will just collapse again. Okay, we're presenting scenarios here, and I'm not saying any of them necessarily will come to pass, or maybe they will, maybe they won't, but these are the kind of thought processes we should be thinking in terms of what happens if there is a collapse. And instead of going, some people somewhere in the Western world have decided they're going to deliberately do this, because we're just highlighting why, if you really did do this deliberately, how the very people who people perceive are the ones who are doing it, what's going to happen to? It's suddenly it becomes a situation where these small minority of people are going to upset the masses. They're not going to, what, they're going to control us all? How? You can't do this. This is not reality. This is not how the world will operate. These people want to keep the system going because they're benefiting from it. But once the system's gone, it's gone, and their day of ruling the proverbial roost is over. And that's the very thing they're trying to prevent. That's why they did what they did in 2008. That's why they've done everything since then. That's why when the pandemic hit, what did they do? They sat there and went, hang on a minute, we've got a pandemic. The risk is the entire economy is going to grind to a halt. The financial system could collapse. Society could collapse. Right, print trillions of dollars, trillions of euros, trillion pounds. Just give everyone everything. And people go, oh, no, they only gave it to certain people. No, they gave it to a whole bunch of to people as well. They didn't pay 100% salaries, but I don't know how many people in the UK were paid 90%, 100%, 80% of their salary. They did everything to stop a collapse. Why? Because they looked at it and went, if this collapses, the masses could turn on the state. We could have total society chaos. They went, no. So immediately just throw every bit of money at everything. Because that was a normal reaction in these situations. Go, we can't risk total societal meltdown. Okay, we know what the consequences of doing that was, and if you print trillions, you're going to cause massive inflation, even though they, of course, for some strange reason, didn't think that was a reality either. But again, if things collapse or we're in that situation, and they're already trying to subsidize people's energy bills and give people grants. I think in the UK, I don't know who qualifies, but something like 40 different financial package assistance that people can apply for. They don't do this if they're deliberately trying to destroy everything. They're doing this to stop sections of society having nothing, being destitute, going, I've got nothing. What are they going to do? They're not going to sit in the house and go, I'm starving, freezing cold, I can't feed my family. My children are hungry. They're not going to sit there and tolerate that. They're going to try and do something about it, whatever that is. And then that's when we slip into societal breakdown. And if society breaks down, we've seen this in history. If you have society breaking down to that extent, it doesn't matter who's in power, it's over, gone. I mean, look at, you want to look at the most powerful dynasty in the world was the Tsars. Okay, it's a different time. It's 100+ years ago. But when the masses rose up against them, okay, the West was behind it. It's not the point. They destroyed their own empire. Well, they didn't come out the end of it. I mean, look what ended up happening. Yeah. I mean, and I'm not suggesting that's the exact outcome now, but once once the masses rise up against people and the risk is they're really worried that can happen, they're not going to survive because people are going to go, I'm sorry, you caused it. You're responsible. And we're not going to tolerate this. But it's, again, we're back to what replaces it. That's a huge risk. And I always say to people, be careful what you wish for. I get people going, I want the financial system to collapse. I want central banks to collapse. I want everything. I go, be careful what you wish for, because you don't know what the outcome could be. You know, we none of us should want that, because that's playing Russian roulette with yourself. You're putting yourself in a situation of not understanding what the outcome could be, what might actually happen to us. We have to hope that never happens, but there's some recognition at some point that this is not sustainable. We have to do something about it. That is the preferable outcome, because otherwise we could end up in a period of time where living life in the West could be very uncomfortable for most people. And I'm sure, if you sit there going, I hope it all collapses, well, you'll be sat there then going, I wish I'd never thought this. So I don't want to see the West collapse, but like that, because that potentially puts us all in very serious, grave situations. So we have to hope that doesn't happen, and that eventually there's going to be enough common sense somewhere to go, okay, it's over. What are we going to do about this? And then we do have to sit round. And I can guarantee if we had a Bretton Woods and China and Russia were there, they'd go, see, I told you, this is the one world government rolling out. And you're going, stop doing this. This is the thing. People will always try to find a reason to justify why they believe something, even if they're ramming square pegs in round holes. The bottom line is China and Russia and Iran and the global south are never going to be part of any one world governance structure. Absolutely no chance will that ever happen. And the reason they're all behind multipolarity is because they're sick of the West trying to control them.
I think they just want to be equal partners. That's what they want.
Yes.
Respect. They want respect. And I really appreciate your perspective. But it seems like even if the people in charge are not trying to collapse things, and it makes sense what you said, the way they're going about it, trying to prevent it, will unfortunately eventually lead to a collapse.
Yes.
Because von Mises always said, once you go down the road of inflation, the only way to end it is, there's two ways. One, you stop the inflation, and I don't think they will, or else the Bank of England wouldn't have done QE a couple of months ago to save the gilt market. And the other one is to just pull the plug, and either one is going to end up with some kind of collapse or reset, whatever you want to call it.
Mm-hmm. No, you're absolutely correct. I mean, but this, it's really just the point of, just because something's collapsing and people can't believe they could be that incompetent. Well, what do they think caused it? I mean, 2008 happened, and we were on the brink of collapse in the Western financial system, literally on the edge. We were literally hours from everything blowing up. Do they think that was deliberate? No, it was absolute crass stupidity. And there was me and other people for 2 years going, it's going to happen. Do you not? No, it won't happen. It won't. Again, it's not deliberate. It is this level of stupidity. We need to start realizing these people who are in positions of power, responsibility, are absolutely clueless. They are so clueless in terms and incompetent. And I'm not saying this. Of course, there's evil and there's people exploiting things. No, because I get people saying to me, "Are you saying that's not the case?" No, I'm not saying that doesn't happen. We know it happens, but there's a world of difference between constantly trying to go see that everything's collapsing, it's deliberate. Well, they need to start asking themselves, who started this story they were deliberately collapsing everything? And why did they say this? And how have they benefited from convincing everyone this story is reality? Who are the people doing this? And start looking at these people a little bit more objectively and going, well, have they stood to gain and profit hugely from trying to convince me this is the case? And what's their motivation? Why are they doing this? And it's like the QAnon movement. It's a great example. You either drive people into euphoria, going, "We're going to save the republic. Trump's going to overthrow all the evil in America," and of course it was garbage and it was never reality. But so it's euphoria or it's abject fear. But in either case, it's an abusive relationship. You're capturing people and you've got them as a captive audience. And if they believe in the euphoria, they'll never want to let it go because they feel it's great. We're going to be saved. I hate the way the world is. There's this savior. And they never want to let go. But people, if you drive them into fear, they'll never let go of the fear. They'll just keep embracing it, going, "Well, it must be true. Look, they told me this was going to happen. Look, it is collapsing." Well, they need to flip that over and go, "Well, was it actually collapsing already? What happened in 2008? Well, that was a collapse. So why didn't they just let it all collapse then?" Because the truth is, if that was the intention, that would have been the time to do it. Why? The multipolar world didn't really exist. China and Russia didn't have the strength they do now, relatively. Much of the rest of the developed world would have just gone, "Okay, it's over. Well, okay, well, we'll take whatever." Now they're actively fighting against unipolarity. Then they would have just accepted it and gone, "Okay, well, it's all blown up. Well, so what are you proposing?" And the Chinese and the Russians would have been in no position to offer any alternative. 14 years have gone by and a lot's happened, which has weakened the West and strengthened the Chinese and the Russians and the multipolar world. So that's the case in point. But they did the exact opposite. So what they decided not to destroy it then, when they could have let go of everything, but now they want to. So why would you spend 14 years trying to save everything and then go, "No, let's just blow it all up now"? It's not logic. It's just not logical. It's not reality. And I know it's hard because I don't doubt there's people who've invested a lot of time and belief in things and really, really are convinced this is what's happening. And I'm not going to try and tell people. I mean, the worst thing you can do is try to tell people what to think because it's pointless, because people get more and more entrenched. But maybe what people need to do is start to say to themselves, "Okay, what's the reality if this happens? What happened in 2008? What really went on? Why did they do what they did? And why are they now deciding to turn their back on all that and just blow everything up?" And ask themselves these questions, and then they may come to a different conclusion. But if you're captive in fear and you believe there's one world governance and technocracy and neo-feudalism or whatever you believe, you're trapped in that state of fear. It's very hard for people to get out of it because some people have been buying into this for 10, 20 years or however long it is, 5 years, whatever it is. They bought into it, and it's very hard once you buy into something to actually go, "Hang on, maybe that's not what's going on."
Yeah, we need to look at the positives. And of course, there's a lot of wrong things going on in the world. But like you said, fear is not a good emotion. And with that, Paul, I'm going to thank you for your time. And maybe you want to tell the viewers where they can find your work.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, well, obviously, it's at SiriusReport.com. That's the website. We obviously do podcasts, and you're a subscriber, Mario, which is, we appreciate you and everyone else who's supported us all these years. And we just detail what is from, and not just from our perspective, what is reality. This is the multipolar world unfolding. This is what it means in economic, financial, and geopolitical terms. This is the demise of unipolarity. And these are all the examples of why we have this demise. And 6 years ago, we laid out what the multipolar world would be. We said Saudi Arabia would rotate east to China and Russia. And at the time, people were getting in touch going, "You're nuts. This is never going to happen." I go, "Watch, it will happen."
Yeah.
So it's about, for me, it's about understanding realities, what's actually going to happen. And not everyone's going to agree, and that's fine. But I think our track record's good. We've laid things out accurately, and And that's all we can, that's what we aim to do. And I'm never going to entertain people or tell people what I think they want to hear. I will always just be objective, and where criticism's due, we'll criticize. And people think I'm very critical of the West. Yes, I am, but the West assumed the role of unipolarity. It decided it was the sheriff in town. Well, it's abused its position, so it deserves to be criticized. I made a point a few weeks ago in podcast going, China's now when it's going to have to take more responsibility. And therefore, from my perspective, China is going to be increasingly more and more under the microscope. And if it makes bad decisions that impacts the world, and we're going to say this is an extremely bad decision they've made. That's just how the world fluctuates and changes. So that's what we do, and we've been doing it for 6 years. Sometimes I wonder, I never really thought how long we keep doing this, but time flies, and I think there's value in doing it, and obviously people subscribe and like what we do. So whilst people keep liking what we're doing, we'll just keep doing it until, I don't know, maybe, I don't know when in the future. Maybe there won't be a point to doing it anymore, but I don't know, but we're probably years off that being the case. So for now, we just keep going and doing our best to make sense of the ridiculous complexities of the world, of which the world is so ridiculously complex. I mean, here's just one small example to highlight the absurdity and the complexity of the world. The United States effectively is fighting a proxy war with Russia and Ukraine. We all know this. But there's a flip side where the United States is on the phone to the Russians every day going, look, we're going to do this, but honestly, we're not crossing the red line. We know we've got red lines with you. We're not crossing it. We're not going to provide these arms to Ukraine. We're not going to do this. We're not going to do that. We don't want a nuclear war. This is the contradiction. That is how it shows just how the world is not black and white. It's so ridiculously complicated. And Russia's talking to them like they're just kind of casual friends going, okay, yeah, we've got an understanding. They hang up, and then it's back to war.
Yeah,
and that's how absurd it's absurd, it's complex, it's ridiculous. But that's how literally how the world operates. And China, the Americans, the Russians, they have back channels. And someone once made a great point to me quite a long time ago, and they said, this is how the world is. You go to bed at night and wake up the following morning, the world's pretty much in the same shape as it was when you went to bed. You wouldn't believe what has to happen to make sure that stays that way. And that's the reality. So whilst all this theatre of wars playing out and all this rhetoric and trying to crush Russia on the one hand, or basically get Russia to capitulate and leave Ukraine or whatever is probably now the stated objective, or always was. Privately, they work a lot together to make sure, by the way, there's the risk of a terrorist attack happening in such a country. We've got some intelligence. We thought you'd like to know this. Well, thanks a lot, Russia. And then it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
It's that kind of, they cooperate, and in the next breath, they're at each other's jugular. So that's how crazy the world is. And that's the same in politics, in finance, in economics. There's 100 different people with 100 different opinions who want to influence things their way. And 99 of them are disappointed, or maybe half of them kind of get half of what they want. But the idea that there's this little group of people dictating global policies on everything, that is not how the world operates in any way, shape, or form. And it's important people start to, or maybe people do, but if those who don't appreciate the complexity of the world we live in, and why, like the polar missile situation, within 2 hours, the reason the State Department and the Pentagon were going, when it's not a point of escalation, is because they knew what happened. Because they know full well Russia's not going to deliberately launch a missile into Poland. Because they know how inflammatory it is. That's, again, Russia, we have red lines. If you do this, you know what the consequences are going to be, and vice versa. That's why the Americans won't give the Ukrainians long-range missiles, because they're frightened the Ukrainians might then start trying to destroy Russian cities, and they know, and the Russians have gone, if that happens, you know what's going to happen in Ukraine. Okay, we don't want that to happen either. Okay, so we'll make sure we don't do this. Even though they're at war with each other, effectively. That's in some ways the absurdity, how infuriatingly ridiculous this stupid world is. And we have to hope more than anything that the stupidity of this comes to an end, and we just have a multipolar world. Everyone agrees to disagree. We live in harmony. We don't try and constantly want to be at war or remove people we don't agree with, and just get on with each other and learn over generations to tolerate each other. We're kind of at that point. That's what we need to happen, because this absurd world we live in is of course no longer sustainable. Hence why we are where we are.
Well said. And thank you very much, Paul, and have a good rest of the day.
And yourself. And thank you for asking me to come on.
Oh, you're welcome.